This is Audible.
Pariah, Ravenor vs. Eisenhorn by Dan Abnett. Read by Helen Keeley. The first section of the story, which is called Queen Mab. Chapter 1, in which I make myself known. This, I think, will be my life story, and it will start here. You will not learn much from me, or you will learn everything. I have not yet decided which. I know one thing, and that is that my life has too many stories within it. It is made out of stories, like a rope is wound from smaller strands, or a mosaic is made of little coloured tiles. I am made of stories. I must leave many of them out, otherwise the one that matters will not make a bit of sense. Someday, if I am alive, I might be persuaded to tell some of the stories I have omitted, but they are lies and fabulations. And anyway, I do not expect to live. My family's name was Bequin, and this is the name I have always used when I am being myself. I was given to understand that proof of this heritage could be found in a marshland cemetery, for my family was a marshland family. But I never thought to check this, or visit the gravestone. This, I realise, makes me seem foolishly trusting. I am not. Besides, if I had seized one day upon the notion of taking a holloway down to Toil Gate and entering the marsh beyond, I am sure that a gravestone would have been waiting for me in the waterlogged plot when I arrived, flecked with the lichen of ages, though it had not stood there the previous sunset. It is said that I am very like my mother. That I was raised an orphan means that I cannot corroborate this either. My status as an orphan explains my situation. I was a ward of the city from a very young age, brought to the Scolam Orbis on Highgate Hill, and raised there, and then transferred on my 12th birthday to the Maze Undue, whose rambling accommodations adjoined the Scolam. This was due to my selection as a promising candidate. Most of the Scolam's wards left the school and went down to the city when they turned 12 and were legally old enough to work. Promising candidates, one or two every few years, were transferred to the Maze Undue. I had therefore lived all of the life I could remember there on the hill, in one leaky, draughty building, or the other backing onto it. My name is Pariah Bequin. The forename is an affectionate contraction of my full name, Elizabeth, and not a unisol label. It is said aloud with a long vowel as in Beitar, not as beta or better. I was found wandering in the marsh as a very young child by a kindly stranger, and upon investigation it was revealed that my mother had passed away of a distemper. The air of the marshes is noisome and can afflict the lungs. If the city is not familiar to you, then let me tell you something about it. The marshes I spoke of are to the south, far to the south, beyond the crumbling bulk of Toilgate where the workers once passed to and from the shipyards. This was in the olden times. Sister Bismillah told me about it when I was a girl. By the time I lived there, the shipyards were derelict, just rockcrete sheds of immense size standing at intervals along the old river slipway, and the lands had been partly reclaimed or conquered by the water, turning them into a grey and misty flatness of wet trees and low, impoverished dwellings. To the west of the city, past Highgate, lay the mountains, which were only ever referred to as the mountains. And to the northeast, beyond the grim structure of Colgate, lay the emptied space, the great Sunderland, whose grey dusts, I was told, eventually give way to the scorched Harrot of the Crimson Desert. The city is called Queen Mab. It is in the prefecture of Hercula, in the south part of the world, which is named Sancor, which itself is in the subsector of Angelus. Queen Mab was once very mighty and important, the mightiest city in the world, and its splendid towers and conspicuous gates were the envy of all other cities in the world, and on many other worlds besides. War made it mighty. But the war ended, and Queen Mab was left spent and exhausted. For as long as I have known it, and far longer than that besides, the city has been in its dotage. It is forever ailing and weak. It is worn out and withering. Many parts of it are crumbling, and there are some parts that are so decayed that no one dares visit them, for fear of dislodging a wall or a ragged roof with no more force than the sound of footsteps. The city has always been an old place, with damp around its feet and dust in its mouth, and a cold wind off the mountains at its shoulder. From my early childhood I rose up through it. Sister Bismillah often said I floated up, from the lowest, wettest part, all the way to Highgate Hill. I remarked to her that this makes me a strong swimmer. She suggested, this simply makes me familiar with the function of metaphor. When I was 12, and not one day more, I entered the Maison Dieu, and began my private instruction by the fourth unspoken branch of the worshipful Ordos. I was selected for this because of certain aspects of my humour, which Mentor Sauer refers to as my temper. I entered the Maison Dieu, and the whole city of Queen Mab became my classroom. Chapter 2, which is of likenesses. There was a quizzing glass in the top room of the Maison Dieu, in which we could reflect upon those souls who, unwittingly, were going to teach us. We read their lives in it, in preparation. I only cared to use the quizzing glass when Mame Mordaunt or the secretary were present. They were the most senior of the Maison Dieu's 4 mentors. We could use the glass at other times, even unsupervised, but I never cared to. The glass was unsettling. I saw things in it that I did not wish to see. I had a mirror in my room, a hand mirror with a wooden frame. You could not quiz in it, and so I preferred it, because it showed only me. I think the mentors would have confiscated it if they had known it existed. The only mirrors we were supposed to use were the quizzing glass and the full-length mirrors, old and silvered, that stood in the robing room. My hand mirror was the only thing that did not lie to me. I could see my face in it. I saw black hair, shoulder length, and a good nose. I had a good nose, a nose of character. My mouth was not particularly full or possessed of ripe lips like some powdered Mamselle of Worth in a romance portrait, but it was mobile and most engaging when it was at its most up or down tilted. I often pulled these expressions in the mirror, so I knew them. My frown could be alarming and could spur people into apology. My grin, with teeth exposed, was equally compelling. My eyes were dark and quite large. I was tall, taller than Corlam or Mentor Merlise, almost as tall as Mame Mordaunt, who I grew up thinking of as a tall woman. And I had a slender build because I maintained a trained condition. I did not know if I was attractive to men or women as Pariah Bequin, because that did not matter, nor had it ever been tested. I knew I could be attractive to men and women in circumstances when I was not being Pariah Bequin. And that was the point. The Maison Dieu was a school. The Ordos established it in Queen Mab a long time ago, as a discreet place in which to conduct the unremarked-upon training of remarkable people. There are, I presume, many others like it in other cities on other worlds. There would have to be, wouldn't there? It was not a school like the Scholam Orbis. That was a home for foundlings, instituted to clothe and feed at the city's expense, lost waifs and teach them their letters, their numbers, and a sufficient measure of the ecclesiarchy's texts. To earn a place in the Scholam Orbis, one simply had to lack a family. To earn a place in the Maison Dieu, one needed to be selected. We entered, usually singly, never more than 2 from any batch of foundlings. I never knew there to be more than 20 students. The Maison Dieu had been for a long time a theatre or playhouse, because the remains of an arched stage still stood in the hall we used as a refectory, and in the undercroft there were traces of stage trapdoors and vaults for technical apparatus, such as lights, scenery flats, and winches. The building's checkered past as a playhouse also explained how the robing room came to be so full of costumes and props. But it had no more always been a playhouse than I had always been an orphan, or a street messenger, or a mamselle's chambermaid, or a rubricator's assistant, or a shipping merchant's life ward, or any of the other things I have temporarily been. It was, I think, originally a place of worship, a clandestine place of worship, raised by one of the old cults of Queen Mab, sponsored by a rich merchant or landowner who found spiritual alternatives to the rigid imperial cult inviting. This was before the war. I guessed this from the name. Maison Dieu. I was studying texts of old terror, ancient terror, in fact, works kept in the data stacks of the Maison Dieu's library. Some of these works were pre-imperial and dated to the time of the Great Crusade, the Unification, even to Old Night and the Age of Technology. They were often written in the languages of these epochs, and I swiftly gained a competency in Old Franc, enough to get by. I have an aptitude for languages. I believe it is an eidetic skill. My aptitude is one of the reasons I am writing this, in the impoverished colloquial in Mabic, the argot of Queen Mab's streets, rather than in Low Gothic, because no one uses in Mabic anymore, and thus very few who will find this will be able to understand it. Anyway, I mentioned to Mentor Merlise, who is the savant and librarian of the House Mentors, that Maison Dieu could easily be a corruption of the old Franc phrase Maison Dieu, or House of God. Mentor Merlise was not very old, but he was extremely frail. He spent much of his time in a walking chair, though he was able to stand. He was no more than 10 years older than me. He had a truly eidetic mind, one that made my talents in that direction pale into insignificance. Anything he saw, he learned. His head was full of data, all instantly absorbed, all instantly recallable. I sometimes thought his mind was responsible for his frailty, as if supporting so much data, so much mental power and knowledge, robbed his body of vigor and nourishment. When I told him my supposition, he smiled at the thought of it and nodded. "Indeed, there is no maze, Beta," he said. He was wrong, as it turned out, but not the way he might have supposed. The playhouse, or maison, or whatever it was when stone was first laid on stone, faced the dusty northeast on the top of Highgate Hill, and all the panes of window glass that looked in that direction were permanently begrimed with desert soot, the grey murk of the Sunderland. Acids and other elemental agues had eaten away the stone and pecked out parts of the roof. Portions of the site were no longer fit for habitation. Rain and moonlight dripped down through broken ceilings. Corridors and floorboards were damp with rainwater and smelled of old cupboards. If it had originally been a temple, then the Templars who crafted it perhaps built what is now the Scholam Orbis as a companion faith school. The orphanage faced west and north, confronting, from the edge of the Highgate Hill crag, the black threat of the mountains. It blunted, too, the worst of the northern weather, insulating the Maison Dieu from the worst of the winters that came knifing south each year. The buildings leant together for support, stone pile against stone pile, and had seeped into each other. They were knocked through in obvious places, in courtyards and walkways. They were linked in secret ways too, secret ways only inquisitive urchins could find after curfew. Common attic spaces and mutual cellars made it harder to discern in modern times, where one building ended and the other began. Each one of us, the candidates as we were known, had his or her own room. When I turned 24, I was one of the 3 oldest still in residence. The other candidates, 8 of them at that time, ranged in age from 22 to 13. The year before, there had been 2 others older than me, Corlam and Pariah. But they had left. They had been selected for service and transferred. We never saw them again, nor expected to. 26 or 27 years old seemed to be about the age when one finished one's training and graduated. We never saw any candidates after they left the Maison Dieu, except Judica. So we had our own rooms. Then there was the top room, for briefing, the robing room, the refectory, washrooms, private quarters for the 4 mentors, and a staff room. The library, which was actually an amalgam of 4 rooms, and the locker and the skirts, which were Mentor Sauer's province. The locker was a sturdy chamber in the basement, where Sauer kept the weapons and instruments. The door, like many in the building, staff room and private quarters especially, was a pane door, and worked according to the settings of our cuffs. I must remember to explain about the cuffs. The skirts were our term for the outlying and largely ruined parts of the Maison Dieu along the eastern wing, where physical training and combat practice took place. These were several rooms and several floors, a dead space not safe for use otherwise. One large chamber in the skirts near to the locker was weatherproofed and lit, and functioned as our most regular training room. We called this the drill. It was in the drill, during my 23rd year, that I first saw a man die close up. And, in the main, he died because of me. Chapter 3, in which I digress to recount the death. Let me tell it, now that I think of it. Frankly, I think of it often, for it shocked me, and left a mark. His death affected the development of my character, so I consider it worth recording, though I appreciate that it was part of a greater story. Thus, it is worth recording in any case, according to the rationale that I set to decide which stories should be included here, and which are surplus. I didn't realize it at the time. At the time, it was just a shocking thing. I was 23. It was late in the day, getting dark. It was summer, though even summer was murky in Queen Mab, and the twilight that settled on the Maison Dieu was always ugly. I had gone down to the locker to fetch a las pistol to practice with. Some bottles on a wall, that was all I intended. Mentor Sauer had been critical of my marksmanship, saying that I lacked the hit rate of Corlam and Pariah, and even, to think, Raud, who was just 15. Also, I had just clumsily finished a function in the Iron Quarter where it would have been useful to shoot better. I had gone... No. That story is certainly surplus here. I needed to practice my pistol shooting. That is what matters. I had seen people die. Let's be clear, Queen Mab is a violent city. I had seen fights. I had seen deaths. I had been obliged to draw or improvise weapons to defend myself and others. I had inflicted injury. It is entirely possible I had caused wounds that led to death, or that my stray shots had, on occasion, slain some wretch that I wasn't aware of. But I had not seen death like this. The drill was lit. The Maison Dieu was generally lighted by wick lamps and candles, and by old glow globes embedded in the ceiling panels. The globes were stained yellow with age and hissed when they burned. In some hallways, we left out sticks or mop handles to strike the roof and jar them back into luminescence as required. The drill was lit. Glow globes shone like sickly suns. I went in to ask Mentor Sauer to reset my cuff so I could bypass the pane door and take a pistol from the locker. The drill was lit. I heard grunts of exertion and thought Mentor Sauer might be honing his blade craft. I didn't know any of the candidates who would be training with him. But he was fighting with someone. They were fighting on the secondary ring, a canvas stage beside and slightly below the main sparring ring, with its wooden railings. To the left were the practice dummies, and a row of Pavis shields and ceramite bucklers hanging on pegs. To the right were the 2 mechanical sparring machines, switched off and dormant, limbs raised and frozen like rearing spiders. I saw drops of blood flecked on the wooden railings, and a small pool tracked in a smear across the canvas of the secondary ring, like a guilty red arrow pointing to them. and I realized it wasn't a sparring session. The man was breathing hard. He was blonde and fairly young and... No, Sauer first. Sauer is more important in this story, and I realize I have done little more than mention his name so far. Mentor Sauer. Thaddeus Sauer. Teacher of combat craft and measures of defense. He was tall and bulky, owning the mass of a fighter. He was a daunting man, and I always thought of him as solid, compacted as if he were wrought from a denser material than normal people, like a neutron star. He had a face like a cliff, clean-shaven, the skin coarse. His mouth was an axe groove, his nose a flattened stump. His eyes were small and heavy-lidded, as if they had evolved to protect themselves, like the eyes of a crocodilian. He was all function, shaved, clipped, trimmed, and undecorated. But his hair was a thick crown of white that hung down over his brow and ears. It was not a distinguished silver white, like an elder statesman. It was yellow white and lusterless, like parched straw or dirty snow. His teeth were small, and he had no little finger on his left hand. Until I met Death Row, he was the most physically intimidating man I had ever known. I had no idea of his age. He was old, a veteran of military service. He had a slight paunch, but that was just the inexorable spread of maturity rather than a lack of fitness. He was brutally strong and viciously fast. As ever, he was dressed in an armoured body glove, boots and gauntlets, all oxblood red, his working clothes. So, the other man. He was younger and slighter, blonde, plainly good-looking in a well-bred way. He was wearing the garb of an imabic merchantman, boots and breeches, heavy wool underrobes and a winter coat of some quality, its collar raised and lined with jezel fur. But I knew at once that this was a disguise. He was dressed the way someone would dress if he had made a close and considered study of Queen Mab's merchant classes in order to pass as one. I do not know what small detail betrayed this to me, but I knew it in a second. Perhaps it was because I have essayed similar feats of disguise very many times, for function after function. His disguise was not imperfect, I felt. It was instead too perfect. They were fighting with short swords. Mentor Sauer was brandishing the thick, twin-edged coutreau he always kept at his side. His opponent, the stranger, should not have been any kind of match for him, in terms of bulk or skill or speed, but he was holding his own. In fact, he was doing better than that. Sauer always carried a snub auto pistol in the back of his belt, and I saw that weapon lying on the floor quite some distance away from them. Sauer's right forearm was cut behind the wrist, and the body glove sleeve was sliced open and flapping. He had drawn first, and been disarmed by a sword thrust. It had only become a blade duel when Sauer had been deprived of his pistol. The stranger was wielding a curved cilinter, or short saber, which I presumed he had brought with him. It was not a local weapon, not even local to the world. He knew how to use it. Besides the disarming wound, he had nicked Sauer on the cheek and the left shoulder. Sauer was going for the face each time. From practice bouts, I knew this to be his way. It is a particularly invasive approach and can provoke rash reactions that lead to failures of technique. One is hardwired to guard one's face, one's eyes. To focus the attack there forces the opponent to fight not only you, but his own autonomic responses as well. Sauer was trying to undermine the stranger's technical control. He was failing. I thought that was remarkable. No one beats Sauer, not in any form of combat. Then I thought, almost simultaneously, why? Why are they fighting? Why is this man here? Blood had been drawn. This was no practice session, no combat lesson for a private client. They were fighting in earnest. The speed of the exchanged blows was ferociously rapid. The stranger was putting everything through his blade and defending with deft footwork, opening the space when he could, staying side-on to minimize his profile as a target. Sauer was trying to keep it tight, trying to close the reach, deflecting the stranger's thrusts with his sword and the metal bands stitched into the forearm of his left sleeve. He maintained a face-on stance, so he could play in both sword and armored sleeve. Sauer was dogged. He started to use his armored sleeve as an offensive weapon, occupying the stranger's sword so he could lunge in with his Kutro. When he jabbed, I thought he had killed the stranger right away, because the short sword's edge sliced through the man's chest. But the stranger rotated and came away fast, cutting down and back with his cylinter to deter Sauer's follow-through. I saw that the stranger's very fine winter coat had been cut open, so that the left lapel lolled away, and the robe beneath was sliced too. I glimpsed beneath that the wire mesh of an armored body glove. The stranger was not as soft as he looked. Sauer was, perhaps, dismayed to discover that the stranger was discreetly armored. His killing blow would have been so sure otherwise. He fumbled slightly, trying to reposition, trying not to lose the upper hand. The stranger caught him across the side of the head. I heard the crack of metal on flesh, the sound of an axe smacking a ripe tuber. Sauer's head was snapped aside, his body rotating after it. Blood flew. It was in his dirty white hair. He crashed backwards into the railings of the upper ring and knocked over a spit bucket. He half fell, yet somehow kept his feet. But he was done. The stranger followed in, the cylinter going for the throat, while his opponent's guard was dropped. You have to remember the speed. You have to appreciate, as I tell you this, that virtually no time at all had passed since I first entered the room and saw them fighting. 3, 4 seconds, enough time for them to trade 24 blows. I had come in with just enough time to grasp the basic situation and see Sauer fall. I never liked Thaddeus Sauer. It's safe to say my feelings towards the cruel bastard were stronger and more negative than that. But he was of the Maison Dieu, and so was I, and this could not be permitted. I started forwards. I shouted out a great cry and snatched a buckler from the pegs. My cuff was turned to dead, so the force of my bluntness came with me and my shout. It can be like a slap to have a pariah come at you, aggressive, unlimited. To even a non-sensitive, irregular human, the psychonic null of a blank mind can be disturbing, if only fleetingly. The stranger recoiled. It was enough of a surprise to stop him cutting out Sauer's throat. My interruption wasn't going to stop there. I hurled the buckler like a discus. The small circular shield missed him, but he was obliged to duck. Sauer was far from finished. He kicked out, savagely, and caught the stranger on the inside of his thigh with his heel, throwing the man sideways, clumsily. The stranger landed, hands on the canvas, but was ready as Sauer propelled himself forwards and kicked the mentor's legs away. Sauer slammed onto his back. I was, all this time, still running at him. I turned the run into a flying kick. He rolled under me, flat to the floor, and sprang up as I landed and turned. I think he wanted to say something to me, but he didn't know what. Perhaps he wanted to tell me to flee, to back away from a fight I had no part in. But he couldn't. If he wanted Sauer dead, he had to kill me too, or the whole house would come down on his head. I could sense his conflict. Unarmed as I was, I drove at him, using his reluctance against him. Fighting Sauer was one thing, but he didn't want to engage a young woman. His response was half-hearted. He tried to shove me away. He tried to spar me with his blade, though it was still in his hand. I think he hoped to clip me with the hilt or pommel, or perhaps knock me out. I would not let him off so easily. I grasped his wrist, turned it, and with my other hand punched the pressure point in his upper arm. The cylinter flew out of his deadened fingers. "Who are you?" I demanded. He rammed me aside with both hands. I staggered and fell, knocking down a rack of wooden exercise staves. I got up, gripping one stave and kicking the others out of my way. The stranger was backing away from me, his hands up. I think he intended to cut his losses and flee. He doubled up as Sauer's Kutro tore into him from behind. The short sword went through his coat, through his robes, through his underjacket and mesh, and sliced into his waist. Sauer ripped the blade free, and blood squirted out across the canvas. The stranger stumbled away, his head wobbling like a drunkard's, his feet unsure, his eyes confused. He had both hands clamped to his waist, but even tight together they could not plug the hole in him. Blood poured out, like red wine from a jug. His hands and sleeves were soaked with it. His mouth opened and closed, without managing to form words. He fell down on his back. Sauer just stood there, watching him bleed out, the bloodied Coutreau low at his side. Blood formed a huge dark red mirror on the canvas around the stranger. The mirror crept out. Blood soaked his coat and robes, covered his hands and flecked his face. He stared at the ceiling, his mouth fluttering open and shut, his legs twitching. I bent over him. Perhaps he didn't have to die, I thought. We could hold him, bind his injury, call for the city watch. I tried to apply pressure to his ghastly wound, but it was open and as big as a dog's mouth. My hands were no better at stemming the flow of blood than his had been. He suddenly, finally, saw me instead of the ceiling and the lights. He blinked, refocused. Tiny beads of blood had lodged in his eyelashes. "What is this? Who are you?" I asked. He said a word. It came out of him like a gasp, more breath than sound. It was a word I had not heard before. He said, "Cognite." There was a bang, right in my ear, and it made me jump because it was sudden and close and painfully loud. A bark of pressure clouted me along with the noise. I flinched as bloody backspatter hit my face, throat, and chest. I had his blood in my eyes. Mentor Sauer put another round through the stranger's face for good measure, and then holstered his snub pistol. Chapter 4, which concerns Thaddeus and the dead man. I looked down at myself, at the quantity of blood upon me, and instinctively raised my hands to my face. My fingertips came away smeared in more blood. It was all over me. "Go get washed," Sauer said. I looked up at him, still kneeling. "Do as I said," Sauer ordered. "Who was he?" I asked. His lip curled slightly. "You heard him say it," he said. "But—" He turned away from me and cursed. "Turn your cuff live, for fug's sake," he said. I did so. I clicked the center band of the metal cuff around to activate my limiter and mask my blankness. The pariah effect makes us hard to like or sympathize with. He knew it. The moment the limiter was on again, he visibly softened. Just a touch. For Thaddeus Sauer was never soft. "You did me a turn there, girl," he murmured. "Bastard nearly had me." I nodded. "His technique was certainly very good," I said. "But I think you would have recovered, Mentor. You were at an angle to parry and then low enough to hit his groin." "Maybe," he said. "Certainly. Femoral artery." "Maybe," he repeated. "I think so," I said. I was just talking, perhaps a little faster than I usually do. I was compensating for the adrenaline spike. "Do you know him?" I asked. Sauer shook his head. "I found him in here, and he went for me." I started to search inside the man's coat and robes. I tried not to look at what remained of his head. "Leave that," said Sauer. "He's a mess." "I am already a mess," I replied. "He may have identification." "What did you mean I heard him say it?" "The word he spoke," said Sauer. "That's what he was. Cognite. Heretic filth. Now leave, Bequin, you've done your part." But I had already found something in the stranger's inside coat pocket and pulled it out. It was a wallet. Leather, quite heavy. I rose to my feet and opened it. The polished rosette crest inside was unmistakable. even though blood had found its way inside the wallet too, and speckled the silver. He is Ordo, I said, confused. No, said Sire. Ordo Hereticus, I insisted. Look at this. The name is given as Voriet, and the rank is Interrogator. He took it from me. Snatched it, in fact. He's not Ordo, Sire said. But impersonation, you dull-witted witch. If your function is to infiltrate an Ordo training facility, what else do you pretend to be? I nodded. So that's a fake? I asked, pointing to the rosette in his hand with a jerk of my chin. Of course. You're sure, Mentor? I can show you a real one if you want to compare. No, I said. He put the wallet in his thigh pouch and looked around for something to place over the corpse. Blood matted the white hair on the side of Sire's head. The stranger's blow had been glancing, but scalps bleed a lot. Go get washed, he said. The tap by the locker. Splash yourself down so you don't track blood into the house. Then run for Mem Mordaunt. Tell her I need her here. Yes, sir, I said. I glanced down at the body again. This is what the Cognitae do, is it? They infiltrate... He glared at me. I don't really see how that's any of your concern. Do you? He asked. Get on it. Though the secretary was the most senior of the Maison Dieu's 4 mentors, Mame Mordaunt ran the house. Her name was Eusebi Dea Mordaunt, but we all called her Mam, a respectful contraction of the formal Mamselle. She was housekeeper, and the logistical running of the Maison Dieu fell to her. She was also our surrogate mother. In most instances, she was a stepmother, and a distant one at that. Occasionally, a more maternal fondness could be glimpsed. This was one of those times. When I fetched her, she expressed concern for my welfare and said I could be counselled if necessary. I was, by then, more exhilarated by the event and intrigued. The trauma would sink in later to leave a lasting mark. Mame Mordaunt was tall and quite beautiful, though it was impossible to gauge her true age. She wore pale powder so that her face resembled a mask, and rouged her lips, and painted on arched eyebrows in stark black ellipses, and drew kohl around her eyes so that she reminded me of a haughty queen in an ancient Grecian tragedy. Her black hair was always braided back off her face. Her gowns were floor-length and black. They were woven from the finest spider silk. She never really smiled. You did well, Beta, she said afterwards. He was a cruel assassin and might have killed us all. I never saw what they did with the body, and to my knowledge the city watch was never called. I did shortly thereafter overhear Mame Mordaunt say to Sire that they must be on their guard for others, a comment I took to refer to the incident. It was not mentioned again, except by Mame Mordaunt, when she asked me once more later if I had been bothered by the experience. She stroked my hair, which was something she did to signify maternal involvement. There was no tenderness in it. To me, it did little more than remind me that her hand was always on us. Don't mention this to the other candidates, she said. I do not want to unsettle them. I could be trusted to do this. I was used to not mentioning things. If you have any questions or concerns, she said, bring them to me or the secretary in confidence. Her hand rested on the side of my face, and she looked at me the way a mother would look at a daughter who fondly brought to mind her youthful self. At least, I think that's what the look was supposed to evoke in me. They kept me very busy for a while after that. Within a day, I had a new function to perform. They wanted me too busy to dwell on it. Chapter 5. Concerning the functions as performed by candidates. The city of Queen Mab was, as I have said, our classroom. During a candidate's training at the Maison Dieu, his or her interface with the many complex social niches of city life came to hone the abilities required for espial and infiltration. I suppose that is why Queen Mab was chosen as the location of the Maison Dieu. It was eternally a perplexing and gaudy metropolis, quite intoxicating in its variety and business. The range of functions, as we called them, varied broadly, but at heart their nature was always the same. That nature was deceit. To begin, Ma'am Mordaunt or the secretary would brief us on the role that we were required to play. Our preparatory work often involved remote viewing of the subject via the quizzing glass in the top room, and even, sometimes, shadowing them in the streets. Mentor Merlise would acquaint us with aspects of custom and language that would assist us, and Ma'am Mordaunt would coach our deportment and help us to assemble our disguises in the robing room. Mentor Sauer would finesse any defensive or offensive technique we might require, and then the secretary himself would review our finished role and refine it before sending us out along the holloways to get on with our business. We were obliged to pose as people, to play act, to pretend. We took on roles, immersed ourselves in other personalities, so we could get close to various target citizens in the great city without them realizing they were being gulled. Often a function came with a nominal task: enter the household of merchant T and learn the combination to his strongbox, work in the court of Mamselle R and bring back a single pearl button from her finest astarish gown, penetrate the manufactory of the industrialist F and discover the name of his off-world brokers, serve as a waiter at the Telthea dining house on the Ludovic Ambulard, and listen in when Duke H next came to supper in order to learn the private pet name he had for his new mistress. Sometimes these tasks seemed essentially pointless. A mistress's pet name? The secret ingredient of a baker's famous confectionery? The number of minutes slow a particular old clock ran in a particular private reading room. They were, I knew, just tasks for the sake of tasks. Sometimes functions dispensed with them entirely. Then it was simply how long could one pass oneself off as someone else, and how far could one get before discovery and flight became necessary. Each function was a contest, a challenge, and the longer one lasted, the better one had performed. If you can, with a little modest preparation, pass anywhere within Queen Mab and learn anything, the secretary told us, then you can pass anywhere outside Queen Mab. We were learning to be actors. Liars, in fact, because convincing liars are all that actors are, ultimately. We were learning to become other people to such a degree we could get lost in the part. Before anyone else could believe, we had to believe. I enjoyed it, for the most part. I enjoyed the challenge. There was rivalry between the candidates, usually friendly. Sometimes if a candidate had to abort a function early, another would be sent in to do better. We learned from each other which disguises worked and which did not. We shared experience-derived tips about body language and micro-expression control, minute details that enhanced a performance and helped to convince a subject. My favorite part of preparation was the robing room. The Maze Undue's theatrical legacy had left it packed with costumes. When a function was handed to me and my role was determined, I rushed away to select the disguise that would help me get into the part. The robing room never disappointed me. No matter what outlandish guise I lit upon, I would find the constituent parts of the apparel I had in mind hanging somewhere on the robing room's rails. It was almost uncanny, though I suspect Ma'am Mordaunt kept the wardrobe supplemented with clothing and props that might be called for. I think of the month I spent in the mansion house of the Marquis St. Worm, in the Traverse Avenues below Faygate. He supposed me, on first sight, to be the tutor of figurative art, engaged to teach his eldest daughter. Corlam had very much wanted this function, and a very fine figure he would have cut as a young private tutor, in a sober black suit and a wide-brimmed hat. I dare say the daughter might even have fallen for her handsome teacher. But I could paint and draw much better than he could, so the function came to me. By the end of the month, I had discovered precisely which congenital allergy affected the St. Worm line, an allergy the private kitchens and chefs worked scrupulously to avoid. A fatal weakness, of most exploitable use, I suppose. to assassins or blackmailers, was now the currency of the Maze Undue. The Marquis, his family, and his vast industrial empire was now critically vulnerable to a piece of leverage, eked out during a lesson in paint washes with a talkative, unguarded girl. I think too of functioning as a junior sartor in the palace of the Silver Countess. You'll have heard of the Silver Countess, I'm sure. One of the most powerful figures in Queen Mab's noble class, and rumoured to be one of the few people to have the ear and support of the mysterious Yellow King. She was the most beautiful woman I ever saw, and I only ever saw her from a distance. Her gowns, resplendent in every way, were the most ambitious and elaborate in the city, nay, the world. So ridiculously luxurious and costly were they, the Countess's chamberlain kept them in a wardrobe annex as secure as a banking house's vault, under the care of the keeper of the wardrobe and his staff of junior sartors. Every dress and garment was catalogued and inspected when it came off her body, every fibre checked, any minute wear repaired. Garments were cleaned, often with abstruse methods, and every single gem or ostrich feather or ivory clasp or jewelled element adorning the gowns was removed, one by one, checked against a ledger, and returned to the wardrobe store. Sometimes it took us a whole day to select, sign out, and attach all the jewels afforded to a particular dress, and then another day to dissemble the outfit and retire it, checking each last gem back in. If a single gem went missing, the name of the last person to handle it was always recorded. Junior sartors had been removed, I think, perhaps even executed, for such failures of care. I took a jewel, a green garnet the size of an almond, attached to a gold hoop, and I never gave it back. The Silver Countess and her master of wardrobe never noticed its absence, however. Another green garnet hangs in its place, on those folds of black crepe silk these days. This one, however, has a Vox transmitter device wired into it. I also think of Corodatus, the ironmaster, the keeper and teller of his own stories. I served him too, on one function, in his verdigrised ruin of a palace below Colgate. He was another mystery I learned about, thanks to a function. I realize these are stories I need not tell. They are simply exemplars. I will tell a story that is pertinent instead. The story of the function of the Blackwoods, and of death row, and of Sister Bismilla's new sister. The story where my stories begin to wind tighter. Chapter 6.